Good afternoon. My name is Mark Storley. I'm a swine field specialist with Iowa State University. I serve the northeast quadrant of our state. I'll be your moderator today as we lead off this afternoon session, which focuses on research. We start off with Dr. Christine Manquist-Wigham. She is the Director of Health for Pepin Farms and DNA Genetic Nucleus. Her roles include overseeing the health of the system of the sows, as well as the downstream nursery and finishing. She is a native of Stanton, Iowa, raised on a farm with row crops and cattle-calf operation. She pursued science and agriculture, earning her BS in biochemistry and molecular biology from Nebraska in 2012. And in 2016, she received her DVM as well as her master's in veterinary preventive medicine from Iowa State University. Christine is a resident of Columbus, Nebraska, with her husband Alex and son Callum. Thank you for joining us today, Christine.
Great. Can everyone hear me okay? Well, really honored to be here to talk today. I know I'm in the research section, but there will be a bit of an applied component to this. I'll talk a little bit about our experiences with different gilt development strategies and then how that's kind of translated to a few research projects. And there's going to be a lot of data today, so I'll try and keep it high level, kind of the main points of the different things that we've looked at. But goal would be just to pick up a few things. And if you've got questions on anything afterward or want to argue with me on anything afterward, welcome the conversation. So real quick. We can move it up here. That's all right. So real quick, just about Pillen Family Farms. If you're not familiar with us, we're around 75,000 commercial sows. We would keep all of our own pigs and market around 2 million pigs per year, primarily a nursery finish system. And then the other piece of this is we are owned by a family who also owns DNA Genetics. So we would have a genetic component to this. So there'll be a little bit of that weaved in, and some of the research would be from the genetic side as well. So first, I'll just touch a little bit on our approach to livability. This is the Sow Summit, so specifically looking at sow mortality. I don't think it's been a secret. Sow mortality has been on the rise and a consistent problem, and for us, that started around 2014, 2015. So we've done everything we can to evaluate mortality within our own system, and then we've tried to identify some trends. What is it farm specific? Is it time specific? Is it intervention specific? And then go from there to look at different strategies on how to evaluate this. So from those observation of trends, we moved into a field data analysis on some of our gilt development practices, and I'll cover those today. And then after that field analysis, that led us to a fairly large-scale research trial on our gilt, and that is just wrapping up. So some of that data was fresh last night, so I apologize if I fumble through a little bit of it. And not all of it's back, but we've got some great data to support some of those field observations. So then after doing those trials, the goal would be to never be satisfied, go back, identify the next thing, go through the whole process and repeat. So I'll start with our sow mortality evaluation. I'll just air the dirty laundry. So this is the Pillen Family Farms sow mortality and prolapse incidence. And I only went back to 2018, if you go back to 2015, the trend's the same. We're at about a 16% sow mortality. And I pulled a prolapse incident. So this wouldn't be mortality due to prolapse. It would be mortalities, euthanized, and culled due to prolapse. So this would be a true incidence rate on our sow farms. And this data is roughly all of that 75,000 sows. So we tracked this over time every month, run the report, and noticed, okay, we're starting to see a downward trend in sow mortality. Why? I don't think didn't really do anything special. It's not like we went in and made a big system change that we knew of, but we were observing this trend and said, okay, we got to go in and see what's different. You'll notice, I will point it out April, May of this year, our mortality has spiked back up. And the theme of this is gilt development practices, and I think we've got some gilt development practices that explain some of those trends that we've seen on the rise there too. So first part of that sow mortality evaluation was looking at all of our removal reasons. So this would be died, euthanized, culled, and nothing really stood out. It's not like we had one reason that was surprising to us. Our majority of our removals were old age parity. Next majority of those removals were for reproductive purposes, not pregnant, and then lambs. I think this is a fairly consistent trend. So then when we looked at just mortality in general, same thing, nothing really stood out. 40% of all of our mortalities were being coded as acute deaths. A lot of those probably were farrowing complications, or it was a dead sow and they just, it was a coding reason. Because I'll tell you, there are some euthanized sows that get coded as acute dead. So, it's a farm-to-farm deal. But then lameness was our second most common reason. And that kind of started us thinking about, okay, maybe we need to look at this gilt development thing a little bit more. So some of our hypotheses on our sow mortality reduction, number one would be gilt development. During this time, 2018 to 2023, we made significant changes to our gilt development structure, which I'll go into. And then additionally, replacement rate and cull rate, we felt probably could have affected our sow mortality. I won't cover those today, but water treatment and health were also on the list. So first, to address the replacement rate and culling rate. We wanted to plot our mortality rate over time against our replacement rate and our culling rate over time. And we were kind of surprised at the trends, overall trending downward for culling rate, overall trending downward from our replacement rate, but really no difference in sow mortality. So this is just 2021 through 2023 where we have seen that decreased mortality. So then we looked at some correlations. Was there any correlation between, at specific farms at specific time points between mortality rate and replacement rate? And you could argue maybe there's a trend as mortality or as replacement rate increases, mortality rate decreases, but it's not a super strong trend. And then we did the same thing for cull rate and saw zero trend at all. So then we were like, okay, maybe it's really more of a gilt development practices thing that's making this huge impact. So I'll jump into our gilt development evaluation. This goes back to 2015, so it's a fairly long evaluation. But I'll cover some of our sites, how our sites are set up, stocking density and performance, and then kind of the field data that we collected through this, looking at growth curves, H&S data, age and weight at mating. So first, just to give a brief overview of what our development structure looked like. We had been doing on-site GDUs. We were single sourcing because we thought, consistent, one gilt source, that's going to result in better performance and better mortality. Everybody had their own on-site developer. We were expecting to have really good performance, but we just weren't seeing that. They're all run continuous flow, and it's a sow farm, so it's not like we're sending our best guy back there to take care of the gilts. So for some different reasons, we moved to an off-site GDU structure. We decided, we're going to commingle everything all at weaning. We've got multiple sites coming in. And that started back in January of 2018, so similar to when we saw those trends on mortality decrease. Those sites are also run all in, all out. So when we pulled our mortality, this is our on-site mortality, so 2015 through 2017, and it varied from site to site, but on average, we were about 8% wean to breed. And so this was, or wean to ship, we tried to keep a consistent age, so assuming, about 22 weeks of age, we were losing about 8% of our gilts, and at some locations, even higher. We were at 18, 20% on some of these developers. When we looked at our off-site GDUs, we saw a dramatic decrease in our wean to ship mortality. So now we were down to a 5.39%, and that was at about 23 weeks of age. So I think the care was better, I think the facilities were better, but we also wanted to just look at, okay, are there other metrics that are measurable that we can define? And first and foremost was stocking density. You've got an available gilt, we're going to shove them in the developer. we're supposed to bring in 240, but what's 270? So I think when you look at that continuous flow structure, our expected stocking density was probably not what we were actually realizing. When we were doing the all in, all out off-site GDU structure, we could really control that stocking density. So I forgot to remove the names of the sites to protect the innocent there. But our off-site nurseries, we were stocking them at between 3 and 3.7 square foot. Our on-site nurseries were close to 3, so not too bad. They were about identical. But it was really our finisher stocking density that was different on our off-site versus our on-site GDUs. So we'd start stocking them anywhere from 6.5 to 8.3 square feet, and that was roughly at around a 7-week placed pig. Our finishers on-site were supposed to be stocked at 8.5 square foot, but again, that if we don't get gilts bred fast enough, we don't get them moved into the sow farm, that gets compacted and compacted and compacted. So then when we looked at, okay, when we're shipping these animals, where's our ending stocking density? And our off-site GDUs, we were 10.9 to 14 square foot. Our on-site GDUs were still closer to that 8.5, probably less. So we assume maybe there's some mortality differences due to those. We like to talk a lot about attrition, and this is a gilt livability talk. So I did want to share just our total values prior to the intervention and after the intervention. So prior to, we were anywhere from 8 to 20% wean to breed mortality with a total selection rate of less than 70%. After the intervention, we were able to track those gilts a little bit better by stage. So we did see, the wean to ship mortality was 5.4%. The percent of gilts entered that never got a service was 7.8%. So our overall wean to breed attrition was 13.2%. So we realized we weren't doing any true selection rate as the receiving gilts from a genetics company. You breed what you get. So we were effectively breeding around 87% of the gilts that we weaned. So after doing that, we wanted to look at our growth curves, because the other piece of this that we saw was we're actually breeding these gilts 3 weeks sooner than we were with our on-site GDUs. So not only was the mortality better, but time to breed was shorter. We'd never really looked at growth curves or what the expectations were, so we did a couple different studies. One was a cross-sectional. We went in and we weighed gilts at the same age across a bunch of different farms and plotted a growth curve that way. And the second one was a longitudinal analysis where we picked one farm and they weighed gilts periodically. And both were really close on those growth curves. So our mature gilts were gaining around 1.4 to 1.6 pounds per day, which is around 9.8 to 11.2 pounds per week. So they're hitting that 300 pounds around 27 weeks of age. When we look at percent H&S, I'll talk about H&S a little bit as we get into this, but we were not hitting great targets. And we look at our 241 research trial, our commercial farms are way below expectation on hitting our H&S targets. So we were only detecting an H&S by 27 weeks of age, they're 300 pounds, we're only detecting an H&S in 38% of those gilts. Yet we are mating 60% of those gilts by 30 weeks of age. So doing the math there, 40% of those gilts that are getting mated never had a skip. Maybe they did cycle and we didn't know it, but we definitely had some opportunity there. So these are just total averages. I'm going to skip through it in the interest of time because I want to jump into this H&S data. But there is definitely the value to the H&S. And as we go into our controlled trial, I think it'll show a little bit more how important getting those gilts H&S is. But this is production data. This is pulled out of one of the commercial sow farms that we were using for this analysis. But when we look at how many H&S events they had versus their P1 total born and their P2 total born and P3, we saw about a half a pig to a full pig advantage if they had at least one H&S recorded on them, and we saw no value to 2 H&Ss. So then we also looked at this by mating weight. We did require them to weigh gilts at mating, and we saw similar trends. If we're targeting at mating weight between 300 and 330 pounds, again, it's about half a pig to a full pig advantage having a skip on that animal. Some additional data, livability is not just do they live or die, it's how long can we keep them in the herd? Do we get them to the herd? So crate acclimation was another thing we looked at, and total performance, because total born directly impacts whether or not we keep that gilt around. So I know there's been some crate acclimation data already today, and I think ours would be really similar patterns. So if we look at the blue line would be our P1 total born, gray line would be P2 total born, and the yellow line would be our P3 total born. And that x-axis would be total days of crate acclimation that they received as a gilt. And we see definite trends. The lowest we would go is 10 days of crate acclimation. And then I know it's really small, but if it's less than 10 days, it's about a little over half a pig difference just getting that crate acclimation. And that is a lifelong benefit that we've seen. So lastly, I do want to hit longevity. It's so hard to get gilt longevity data. It's hard to track them through unless you've got individually tagged animals. But we had one farm that was willing to do this and look at this. So this was looking specifically at age and weight at mating. But we saw a significant drop-off by mating large, if their first mating was at a significantly heavy weight. So after 370 pounds, very few of those made it even to their parity two. They were too big for a stall, or they got lame, or we had structure issues, and nobody made it. So this is total, lifetime productivity. I mean, honestly, after that 330, 340 weight, we see a decrease in lifetime productivity. So our goals are, how do we get that gilt in the herd at the correct weight? How do we get her mated at the correct weight while still capturing that total born advantage through one skip and crate acclimation? So overall, field data conclusions were the offsite GDU. We saw better performance specifically with growth and mortality. The constant gilt sources where we're commingling at weaning and having higher health at farm entry was a big deal. Trying to hit that first cycle with an H&S between 24 and 27 weeks to breed them between 27 and 30 weeks at a target weight of 300 to 325. So the next steps are our 241, our development trial, and we have one of our interns is here today, and bless her, because this was a very, very intense trial. So the goal of this trial was to observe the impact of stocking density on gilt estrus and structure. So it was a wean to finish barn, but the trial started at the beginning of the finishing phase. So at placement and finishing, they were either 7.6, 10, or 13.4 square feet. And we did that just to keep it consistent, throughout that entire finishing phase. So the rationale, again, was to document growth rates and timing of estrus given those different stocking densities. And then also, hopefully, we'll be able to attach an economic return on allowing extra space to these gilts, because that's been one of the biggest battles is, okay, we think we need more space. How are we going to pay for it? How are we going to justify it? So we enrolled a little over 850 individual gilts in the trial. We started heat checking them at 20 weeks of age daily. We additionally did some progesterone assays at 24, 26, 28 weeks of age to the whole herd, and then again at 30 weeks of age on animals where we didn't have a detectable cycle. Part of that was to look at accuracy of heat checking by stocking density. And then we collected weights. So we have, wean weights, end of nursery, 24 weeks of age, would all be individual weights, and then we've got some pen weights and feed intake throughout there too. We think structure is a big deal for longevity, so we did do two people did structure scoring, just assigned a 1 to a 3 at the end of the nursery and at 24 weeks of age. And then we collected some biological parameters as well, and that data is not back yet. So probably the most surprising finding for me was, we saw this huge difference in mortality with the offsite GDU, with the stocking density, and we saw no difference in overall finishing mortality across treatment groups. So, only 850 gilts on trial, so picking up really any difference is hard on mortality, but we didn't even see numerical trends. You could argue maybe there was a trend to have more respiratory deaths in our lighter stocked pens, that 13.4 with our nursery turn ending at 6-7 weeks of age, these pigs were placed in January. So potentially just not having that pig density and heat, there was more respiratory deaths. But then conversely, we did see more deaths due to lameness, ulcers, in our tightly stocked pens. So I think there could be some trends that we can sort of assume from this data, but no real strong conclusions. The weights were definitely significant. So we didn't see much of a difference on weaning weights and on-test weights, which is great because the trial hadn't started yet. But then when we look at our week 24 individual weights, we did pick up a difference. Those that were stocked at 7.6 were statistically lighter than those that were stocked at the 10 or the 13.4 square foot. And remember that 24 weeks of age, that's when we're really starting to pick up our H&Ss. And then looking at 31 weeks of age, we saw statistical difference between all three groups. So hopefully by 31 weeks of age, most of the gilts are moved out of the developer, but we wanted to have this final endpoint. We also looked at first mating weight, and we saw some differences, but this is a bit skewed because not all the gilts had been mated at 31 weeks of age, so there's still some data to look at here. We did also want to look at some just raw means by milestones. So looking at that stocking density and then how many out of that stocking density, cycled, what was their age at first cycle, the weight at their first cycle, how many did we have bred? Again, this was only at 31 weeks of age, so this is not the entire group. But we did see some pretty significant differences in the raw means on each of these. So our percent cycled, and you're going to see this trend, but looser stocking density, we're getting more to cycle, we're getting more bred. So remember, we had our interns doing H&Sing, and then we also had these progesterone bleeds. So this graph is showing the percent cycled that was detected by our actual heat detectors, not by the progesterone assays, because our theory was as pens get tighter, is it going to be a little bit more difficult to catch gilts in heat? So 20 and 21 weeks of age, we just did alleyway heat checking. And then at 22 weeks of age, we started bringing boars into pens. So you can see really we did see that spike 22 weeks of age doing that boar exposure in pens. And at 22 weeks of age, we're pretty close, but we quickly separate ourselves. That loose stocked 13.4 square feet, hits it out of the park as far as number cycled that we were able to detect with heat detectors. So when we look at our actual progesterone data, we see the same trends. So the percent cycled by week 24, we're pretty close at week 24, really no differences. Overall, grand total, 27% of those gilts had a cycle. When we look at week 26, we start to see some separation, but still fairly close, and 50% of our gilts had cycled. So remember our Pillin data, by 26, 27 weeks of age, we'd only detected an H&S on 38%. We know that 50% have actually cycled by that time point. So we're missing some on our on-site developers. But then when we look at our 28 weeks of age and 38 weeks of age, just that really tight stocking density has impacted the percent cycled. And we're getting 10% more of our loose stocking density gilts to cycle than that tight stocking density. So when we compare that progesterone assay to the heat detection that our interns did, we also see the accuracy go up on our looser stocked pens. So pretty close at that 24 weeks of age, but then when we get out to 28 weeks of age, we see a 7% increase in accuracy on our loosely stocked pens. And it went both ways. Some of it was we called them positive, they were actually negative, or we called them, we hadn't detected a heat and they actually were positive. So it wasn't, we've got to look at that a little bit closer, but it wasn't like we were just missing a ton of heats. So I'll jump into our structure and lesion scores. So remember we had gone through and done some structure scoring, and then we also added a lesion scoring component. We actually saw 0 difference in our structure scores. So when we looked at on-test, there really shouldn't have been any difference, and there wasn't. But then when we looked at that 24 weeks of age, which is when you typically go in and do a selection, we didn't pick up any difference on our 2 selectors on animals that we would have selected out of those 3 groups. The lesion scoring was done at 31 weeks of age. And again, it was just a 1 to 3 score, but we were looking at, mostly it was fighting, but just different injuries on different areas of the gilt. And we did see a significant difference in the number of lesions that those gilts had in our tightly stocked pens and even our medium stocked pens versus that loose 13.4 square foot. Some additional observations from this trial. Yes, we had a treatment applied, but we also had all this individual data at weaning. So we looked at our weaning weight ranges and then percent of those that ended up cycling and percent of those that ended up breeding. So this would be closer to that attrition rate that I showed with our field data. But size at weaning does make a difference. So I know I fight with my nursery guys all the time when they complain about these small gilts they're getting. They won't make it into the herd. They're not going to make a great sow. And I hate to go back and tell him he's right. But we saw a huge difference on like an 8 to 10 pound pig versus a 20 pound pig. We're talking, 25% more that cycled and, 30% more that bred by 31 weeks of age. So additionally, we looked at the wean weight effect on wean to finish mortality. And I think that these values are pretty well established in grow finish pigs, but it's also nice, this is a test farm. It's a wean to finish barn, but this is people that are generally taking pretty good care of them. But we had a fairly good gap. These animals weren't sourced out of a high health nucleus. It was what a retail multiplier would ship out. But we saw significant differences in weights at 11 weeks and weights at 24 weeks, and then overall mortality. So our lightest pigs were closer to, between, around that 15 to 20% mortality, and our heaviest pigs were closer to that 7 to 9% wean to finish mortality. So our overall take-homes from this trial, stocking density affects gilt growth rates. So I don't think we're going to go out here and recommend that everybody stock their gilts at 13.4 square feet at placement in the finisher. We didn't see a value to that, especially on our early metrics. So I think there's probably some work to be done earlier, but we do know once we get into that H&Sing and really they're going from a prepubertal gilt into where we're starting to exhibit signs of estrus, stocking density does matter. And it affects growth rate as well. So we also know that stocking density affects the accuracy of heat checking. They spent hours and hours in those barns heat checking. So it was 2 very dedicated people going through and heat checking, and we still saw, only 75% accuracy on some of those tightly stocked pens. And then I think lastly, just overall estrus activity in general, that stocking density does affect whether or not those gilts cycle. And seeing a 10% difference, if we're talking wanting to be able to breed 85% of our gilts or 75% of our gilts, that's a big deal. Economically, that's a big deal for sow farm throughput, and it's a big deal for being able to keep gilts in the herd long term. So our overall gilt development strategy, I'm not going to stand up here and say that Pillen is doing all of these things. I think we've got a lot of data that we know, okay, here are some trends, here are some things that we should work toward, but to say that each of these is getting executed every day, it's not happening. So I think that there's a lot more that we can do. I think we understand also that the impact on livability probably starts early. This was just a finishing trial. It was higher than we expected levels of mortality. We didn't go back and look at that nursery phase, so I think there's probably some opportunity there. Through our field data, we do know having dedicated care to gilts at an off-site development, we see better performance, better growth, better mortality, and I think a lot of that has to do with that all-in, all-out strategy. Next would be square footage allotment is necessary to not restrict the growth and reproductive capabilities of the gilt. That's been a hard sell. I'd have to guess, but it's probably 60,000 spaces we've had to add just to execute this. So it's, not been a minor investment. But then, strategies for gilt development will impact the ability to get the gilt into the herd in the first place. So yes, we're talking about livability, but livability is impacted by a lot of these things. So if we have better growth, we have better cycling. If we have earlier estrus detection, then we have an increased chance that we have time for that animal to get a crate break and a skip. If we get a crate break and a skip, we have better lifetime performance. We've got all that data. And if we have better lifetime performance, there's a much higher chance that she's going to stick around for that, P2, P3, P4, and be a productive female for us. So last would just be, this is a message that we try and coach within our system, but care and consideration needs to be taken to weight at mating. It needs to be taken to our H&S practices, and it needs to be taken to our crate acclimation strategies. So our next steps are continuing to look at longevity. Really the only longevity piece that we've been able to pull out with this data is looking at that lifetime performance. So having some individual gilts from birth tracked through our system, I think we've got around 40,000 now throughout different farms that we'll be able to pull some longevity data on, I think is going to be critical to defining our next steps for research trials and for ways to keep etching away at that sow mortality number. All right. I guess any time for questions or?
Yes.
Okay.
Does anybody have any questions for Chantel?
So with the increase in the additional square footage, do you think that the biggest benefit came from the ability to access feed with less competition, or would you say it's less labor, more labor is focused, I guess, in one spot and at least amount of animals, or would you say it was the added nose-to-nose boar exposure that they would get from having less animals in that pen?
I think it kind of depends on the stage. So in the nursery phase where we saw a pretty good jump in mortality, I think that's just solely care, just having dedicated team members in there to do that. In the finishing phase though, I think access to feed was a big deal. These offsite finishers, it's not like the Taj Mahal of feeders, but just having that extra space to eat. Because 3 weeks difference in growth rate. We'll have intake data from this trial, but I'm sure a lot of it is intake driven. And then the H&Sing, it's an interesting point. So this, we're in pens, we're H&Sing in pens. That strategy varies just kind of depending on the site. If we bring them into the developer before we H&S, or if we H&S them on an offsite location, I could probably speak to some of the breed projects we've done, and I do think that it is a huge deal having that space to do the H&Sing in pens for those breed projects. When you're on site and you can do kind of do more in crates, I don't know that you see that advantage.
Okay, I have a question to follow up there with your nutrition comments. Do you think if you change the nutrient density or some of the variables in the diet that you might have an interaction between stock density and nutrition? Have you taken a look at any of that? Yeah, so full disclosure, I am not a nutritionist, but that is definitely something that we talk about quite a bit. These diets, so when we were running continuous flow, it was really hard to manage multiple diets. So they, in the developer, only saw 2 different diets. One was fed from placement up to 150 pounds, and one was 150 pounds plus. So we probably overfed them a little bit on nutrients. This was a stocking density trial. We didn't really want to restrict them, but these are diets that all of our pill and gilts would already be on. So that's, next steps is looking at diets, but didn't really focus on that with some of this. So
it's very intriguing information you have with going to the commingling sites and having the off-site development. Any concerns or any issues so far with having on-site versus off-site, and any train wrecks yet?
Oh, of course, there's been some train wrecks, but so the risk is when you're commingling. We've got a robust testing program, but when you send a positive something to that site, you lose the whole site. So there's been some, I think overall health has been good, but there have been a few instances where, you put yourself at additional risk. So I'd probably add site selection. Biosecurity practices are critical when doing the offsite gilt development, and keeping that number of sources as few as possible and consistent is critical.
Do you isolate them into the herd?
We do, yep. So that process hasn't changed. We've got the on-site developers. They all have to, so we've not broke sow farms, but a couple of the off-site GDUs have had some, purse break or PED break here and there. But yeah, no sow farm issues because all would go through isolation. Yeah.
One thing on your data you showed between 320 and 340.
Hold up to the mic. There you go.
You showed on your first set of data between 320 and 340 a nice bump in lifetime productivity. You go less than that or more than that and things drop off. And then on your gilt development space study, you showed a much higher off-test weight at the higher space, but again, an improvement in lifetime productivity with the improved space. How do you, reconcile that data, and then how do you propose controlling that body weight gain in a system?
It's so hard. Trying to get farms to weigh gilts and hit that target weight, so that one of them is just data we pulled from a sow farm. So they didn't have a protocol. They were just, weighing gilts and doing their thing. But yeah, that's part of establishing the gilt growth curve and having consistent conditions every time to get that growth rate. And we're still going to have some that are light and still going to have some that are heavy. I think some of this trial data is a little bit skewed because we're only pulling those animals where we had an HNS or we had a cycle. So those weights are specifically for ones that did cycle or did have an HNS. And so those are your top performers anyway. We know in a group of gilts, the ones that grow really fast, you've got some that are just going to cycle early, be lifelong performers, and really good productive gilts. And genetically, that's what we want to capture, is those animals. But from the production setting, how do we get the rest of the herd, to kind of catch up? And so that's what these production practices are looking at. How do we get the bottom enders where we need them to be?
Real quick, Christine, so on those, are you following then your different stocking densities through and look at retention at third parity? Will you be able to do that?
So for that study, yes. I will tell you only probably 200 or 300 of those animals are going to hit a sow farm. The sow farm it's real life, right? The sow farm they were intended to go to didn't get out of their PRRS closure soon enough. So we lost some of those breeds. But some of them, yes, we will be able to follow through.
So you showed the differences in wean weight and percentage of pigs that had a recorded cycle and percent that were bred. So should we develop a threshold and say pigs under a certain weight we should not accept or automatically cull?
I think that's probably what our production teams are going to push back on for us too. There's probably a fine line. Some of those are going to make it, but I think it's really up to your own system what you want to do. We're at 8 pounds today, so.
Thank you, Chantel. Please give her a round of applause. Christine, I'm sorry.